well, welcome to the podcast. I'm Joel here with my dad.
And I'm Rick, and we are so glad you're here today.
Hey, so Dad, one of the things, our regular theme on this podcast is kind of looking at stories of growing up and watching how you led our family, things you did right, sometimes the things you think you could have done a little better. And I was thinking right now, specifically in this time that we're in, of kind of everybody feeling limited, like there's kind of this silent enemy out there. We're not sure what we can do. Invisible. And I was thinking about limitations. And one of the things that I noticed with our family, and particularly with you, watching you start the mission when we were on the mission field, we had to start very small. And I remember it was basically, you started the whole organization with a fax machine and an idea, basically.
Yeah, we did have a fax machine. That's right. We did have a fax.
And I remember, first of all, you were trying to be obedient to God in starting it, but you didn't feel like this was something you had. Well, I don't know. You felt a sense of having to do it. Yeah. But the reality was, it was really kind of challenging because we were limited. First of all, you didn't have any money to start it with. There was no money.
Yeah, the fax machine, in fact, we got at a pawn shop.
Yeah, that's right. Somebody had a cheap fax machine, and we're in Guatemala, didn't have any money, living off of our support, and you're feeling like God's start calling you to start this global missions agency.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges a lot of us feel, is there's something deep within our hearts that we really want to accomplish, and maybe you see a huge need. I've always felt that everybody's got a message to share and a problem to solve. So when you see what that problem is that you're called to solve, it gets super overwhelming. And you're like, man, I need this, and this to get started with.
Yeah.
And most of the time, you actually don't. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I learned a lot of my lessons from other people's mistakes. I always try to learn from the pain of other people, so I don't have to endure the pain myself. And as you know, just before we went to Guatemala, we were involved in a ministry that was going to be a missionary training center, and it was going to be a church, and I was to do the church, and someone else was going to lead the missionary training center, and then there was someone kind of overseeing that. And before I got involved in it, the leadership had already committed to 18 acres of property and $250,000 worth of debt, and just a lot of commitments, because down the road,
which $250,000 30 years ago was a lot more than now.
It was like $1 million now. I mean, it was so overwhelming. It was just so unbelievable. And but those commitments had already been made. And thinking about it, when I got into the middle of it, I realized the property and all the things that they thought were necessary to do this were really just albatrosses around our neck. They were just weights that kept us from being able to fly, and do anything. And so I began to realize, that, wow, you just start where you are. And I realized there was nothing that we ever did in that ministry that couldn't have been done in a rented home in town, and a lot more effective. Just rent a place rather than making a financial commitment like that. So when C10 started, I felt like, Lord, okay, I've already, in fact, when we went on the field, somebody was encouraging us, well, just go, because once you get on the field, then God's going to provide all this, and that's living by faith. And I thought, you know what? I've tried this living by faith thing. And I think I'm going to live by prior faith rather than afterward faith. In other words, I'm going to believe that God's going to provide ahead of time to confirm his direction, rather than praying and crying at the end of every month that I'm going to be able to make my bills. So I decided we were just going to, if we didn't have it, hey, God, this is your deal, and if you want it to happen, you either provide the money or it's not going to happen. And I think that really helped too, because I wasn't that committed to making it happen and grow.
Well, I kind of wonder if sometimes the reason we think we need all that stuff is because it's the idea of fake it till you make it. I see businesses all the time that go out and rent all this space that they don't need. Well, we need an office. People need to take us seriously with an office. You're like, well, not necessarily. You don't necessarily need an office if it's going to tank you financially.
Yeah. That's the thing. What we look at as resources. Somebody said this. They said you never own anything. It always owns you. And you can think about that if you have a house. Oh, honey, we own a house. No, you don't.
Yeah.
It owns you.
Even if you truly own it outright.
Yeah. There's still things breaking down.
Yeah.
There's still things that need repair. And, at the most inconvenient time, it says, hey, by the way, I'd like a new water heater.
That's right. So that is a challenge, I think, with a lot of people, that they feel like they need. So I was talking to Jonathan about this the other day, and he used the word minimum viable product. Like, what's the minimum thing you need to start with? What's the bare bones you need to start with? And as you see with C10, an idea and a fax machine while living in Guatemala, it was enough.
Well, and we had volunteers in the States. We found 4 volunteers. I just prayed. I felt like God put 4 families on my heart, and I contacted them, and they offered to do the work here, so we didn't pay them anything.
Which is amazing. That's one of the things, too, as people start things, is you think, oh, I got to hire somebody. But, man, you'd be amazed how much free work people are willing to give if they believe in the product.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a benefit to them because they feel like they're giving something. They're investing something.
That reminds me of Phil Vischer. I think we've mentioned that Phil Vischer book over and over again, Me, Myself, and Bob, where he talks about when they started having to do layoffs. And a bunch of the people came to him and were like, hey, Phil, why didn't you just tell us you need money? I would have worked for half of what I'm working for.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, you forget that
the intangible value.
And we all I know that. I mean, I find that with me sometimes. And this is a challenge for a lot of people too. If you think big, we're in a country where everybody's like, go big or go home. And so you immediately think, I'm going to need this and that and this and that and this and that and this. But nowadays, really, I mean, if you've got a computer, you can get started on pretty much anything. In our day was a fax machine, but I just think that's so important. And what I think is powerful about it, there's this quote I love by T.S. Eliot, and he says this. He says, when forced to work within a strict framework, the imagination is taxed to its utmost and will produce its richest ideas. Given total freedom, the work is likely to sprawl. And I've seen that with organizations that have loads of money just make these massive blunders. And I mean, waste millions and millions of dollars. And they didn't, it's just because they have the luxury of being able to blow money and they don't have to be creative.
Yeah. And they don't have to take counsel from other people either. We had a situation happen where we had somebody referred a couple to us, and they came and they said, hey, we've got this vision. We got this dream. We just see tents all over Central America. Could you help us get tents? And I'm thinking, well, I don't really know if anybody needs a tent, but they desperately wanted to give a tent. So I went and talked to the pastors up in Nebac. I said, would you guys like a tent? Like, what? We don't really need a tent, but sure, big circus type tent. So we had one big crusade. All the pastors got together, did this thing. And it's a small village up in the mountains there. And actually, I guess it's a small town, actually. Anyway, it was funny because then they felt an obligation to take care of this dumb tent after the crusade. They built a little house for it. And so this tent lived in a better house than some of the pastors did. It actually had a concrete floor and block walls and stuff, And so I thought, it's so crazy because I tried to tell these people, look, here's something you could do that would really help. But oh no, we had this vision. And I realized how many thousands of dollars were basically wasted.
Yeah.
Because they had the money and so didn't have to listen to anybody. Didn't have to take counsel from anybody.
It reminds me of a project we saw in Peru where we went to this one place and we walked around and we saw all these beautiful silos. And I was like, wow, those are amazing. I mean, it's probably like $200,000 worth of silos. I was like, what's that? Well, that was a grain project we were going to do, but then we learned that grain doesn't store at this altitude. I was like, wow, we didn't do any research.
We didn't check it out.
Then you walk through this beautiful avocado, all these avocados, and they're like, wow, this was our avocado project. I'm like, man, you must have tons of avocado. Well, we actually found out they don't work at this altitude. I'm like, oh my gosh. Then they had a fish farm, and they were funded, very well funded, at this fish farm, and they built this beautiful fish farm, but they didn't realize that every year water drains from the mountains around and washes out the fish farm. It's like,
so they're stocking everybody else's pond.
That's but they didn't. When you have money, you're not forced to get creative. But that's the power, I think, of being limited. Is it forces you to get creative because you've only got so many resources of time, energy, money. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of us make. Is we think once I've got X, I can get started.
Yeah,
but that's really not the case.
I was kind of praying about that one time. I was thinking, man, Lord, just what we could do if we had all these funds and resources. And I was reminded of that story with the tents and these other stories like that, that, I believe one of the reasons God is kind of holds back sometimes is because, again, we need to exercise some creativity. We need to remain dependent upon Him. We need to remain in constant touch with Him. And if we have all the resources, He could very easily just, like with Moses coming out of the wilderness there, He could have very easily just said, "Hey Moses, here's a map. I'll meet you in the promised land in 40 years."
Right.
But He wanted Moses day by day to be dependent upon Him. And I believe that's what the Lord wants too, because if we have those resources, we don't really have to pray. We just, let's give it a shot, and we'll see how it works, and
that reminds me of the story of Gideon, where Gideon's like called on by God to attack the enemy, and he rounds up a really great army.
Yeah.
The guy's like, nope, you got too many people. He's like, what?
You never have too many.
You never have too many people for an army. You want shock and awe, right? He dwindles it down to essentially 300 people. I mean, like 10% of what he initially had.
Yeah.
And then they end up wiping out the enemy. And of course, the lesson is that we've always been taught from Sunday school was, that when God, God wants the credit for the victory. And I think that's the case a lot of times with us, where we say, the smaller it is, the more, actually that's another thing too, is the smaller you are, the more agile you are. Yeah. We're seeing that right now with this economy that we're in.
Yeah.
People that had a massive infrastructure that they have to maintain with the COVID thing that hit, they're freaking out, right? Because they've got to maintain all of this stuff. But smaller companies that are a little more quick on their feet, they're coming up with quick ways to change the way they do delivering. I heard a shoe store is doing concierge shoe services now. They're delivering the shoes to you, fitting you at your house. I'm like, wow, like
how cool.
They got on their feet really quickly with that. But they have maybe 12 employees, and they say, hey guys, get in your cars and let's go do this, because they're not coming to us. So in some ways, being small gives you more agility, more flexibility.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge you're facing now with the mission. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you're like, we can't do all the same stuff we used to be able to do.
I actually had to start another agency to be able to do some of the stuff that we used to be able to do, because it has gotten so big and unwieldy. And it's wonderful because, everything has its place. I've got this humongous wrench that I think I inherited from your grandfather. It's this humongous pipe wrench.
Yeah.
And man, it is impressive. You walk around that, you look like a real man, but I've never been able to use it for anything. It's too darn big. It's just too big.
Until that one day when you need that thing.
I think it would be useful for taking down power lines and stuff, those big old bolts, but I can't use it around the house. But man, I love that wrench. It is so cool. And it's kind of the same way, you can get a big wrench has its purpose.
Yeah.
But so does that tiny little wrench. And it just depends. And so big organizations, there are things we can do with C10 now that we couldn't do before.
Yeah.
Awesome. Blessing. Wonderful. It's just great. But there's also things that we needed a smaller organization to be able to meet this need here and that need there. So, I was thinking though too, I remember reading when Southwest Airlines turned 50 years old, they had that book it was just when you had gotten hired on.
I think there was when they actually turned 20 or 25.
Yeah, it was 25. Yeah, because I think they probably aren't 50 yet. 25. Yeah, they had a book called Still Nuts After All These Years. And in there, one of the things they said was about how they had to remain flexible too. And even though they were a large organization, they had to flex many times, and they talked, a lot of their strength was in their flexibility as well, and the flexibility of their employees. And so even when you get big, many times you can use creativity to meet a need, but sometimes I think we get so big and we get kind of comfortable in our ways, and you just kind of get big and fat, and you're just not flexible anymore. I mean, companies, corporations, organizations are just like people. When we get a little overweight and a little tubby, we can't bend down and touch our toes like we used to be able to. We're just not as flexible as we used to be. And so I think that's a key to success is what you talked about earlier is starting with just a bare minimum and not trying to really impress anybody. I think that was one of the reasons that Commission to Every Nation did well was I had no great dreams of making it grow.
Yeah.
I just loved what we were doing in Guatemala. I didn't want to be director of a mission agency.
Well, and even a few years in, you didn't have a building. You worked out of a church that offered you some space. And that's another thing I see a lot of people too, is they want, you feel like you have to have a certain level of something to impress people. But I've found that, man, people understand being limited, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you're honest about it, say, hey, I'm just getting started. And, as a real estate agent, a lot of people are like, you got to have a really nice car. I'm like, man, not if it's going to cost you're the first 6 houses you sell to pay for that car.
Yeah.
And so limitations, I think when you admit your limitations and tell people, I'm just getting started, then it can actually be a blessing. And the other thing about it, I got started then back on the limitations idea. I remember the first time we found out that Emily was allergic to gluten, and gluten is wheat, right? So I remember I do a lot of the cooking at the house, and I remember thought, oh my gosh, I can't cook anything, because if you look at the little ingredients on anything.
Everything.
Wheat is in everything.
Yeah, it's everything. It's everywhere.
And so I thought, man, cooking is going to be so hard. And I was talking to Emily about it the other day. I'm like, you realize that for the last 3 years, we've known about, or actually been like 5 now, we've known about this. And I don't feel limited in any way because I can't use wheat. You just know what you can use and what you can't use. And I think that's a huge part of it. Is at first you feel limited, like I can only do this or that, but really, once you know the parameters to operate in, I mean, this is a big concept here, kind of like lofty thinking, but once you know the parameters to operate in, then you are free to really do whatever. It's kind of like what they say with music. You've got to learn all of the rules of music so that you know how to break them.
Right, yeah.
And then the truly creative stuff is like, wow, that note shouldn't have been in that scale, but he threw it in there, or she threw it in there, and that was really creative, that little almost sounding, it would have sounded dissonant otherwise, but you know how to break the rules. And that's the thing about it. Once you really, there's power in understanding your limitations, which nobody wants to admit we have limitations, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens is we overrun ourselves. I think that too, I see that a lot of times with people is they think there's 27 hours in the day. And so they book themselves 27 hours worth of stuff for a 24-hour day. And it's like, well, that's not going to work. And so they're always the ball is always dropping on something. And until you can acknowledge your limitations, you really can't thrive within it.
Yeah. When I was working with kids, I learned how to juggle, and I can juggle 2 balls, and I can juggle 3 balls, and I can do it behind my back and under my leg, and I can bounce them and juggle and do that sort of thing. But I never got to where I could do 4 balls.
Right.
So if you watched me juggle 3, you'd say, wow, that guy can really juggle. If you watch me try to juggle 4, you go, that guy doesn't know the first thing about juggling. And it's got nothing to do with ability. Well, it does have to do with ability. I just can't do 4 balls very well. I can do them for a few little rounds. But the point is, as long as I stick with 3 balls, I look awesome.
Yeah.
When I pick up that just one extra ball, I fall apart and everything goes to pieces and I look like an idiot, The same way with us, you might be great at juggling 3 balls, or you may be able to do 4 or 5 balls, but we all have a limit somewhere. And when we go beyond that limit, we begin to drop things. We begin to look like an idiot instead of just backing off a little bit and sticking with where you're good, sticking with what you know.
Well, and I mean, that can apply to time. It can apply to energy. I mean, that's a challenging thing too. As you get older, you just can't quite do as much as you used to be able to.
Already?
I'm already noticing it. I saw a thing on the internet the other day that said, welcome to your 40s. If your random ailment hasn't been assigned to you yet that's unnameable, we'll give you one shortly. I'm like, well, I have that. I'm like, what's this? So there's some sort of a limitation we all have.
Yeah.
And you can get down on yourself and get tyrannical with yourself. I should be doing more. Or just say, it is what it is. And, but then there's freedom in that, because then you know what your parameters are. And I think that's the challenge of figuring that out with kids. For example, with kids activities, your kids are probably, I see this a lot of times, the kids are tired of the activities. And a lot of people are telling me that now. They're like, with everything canceled, we're realizing, wow, we were so busy doing so much stuff. And we're like, and we thought it was all necessary, but we're surviving without it. And
kids are happy and they're making it and they're finding other things to do.
Yeah, the kids are like, oh, I'm so glad we don't have. I remember that as a kid, even too. I would get tired, towards the end of baseball season. I don't want to go to another baseball practice, or towards the end of, and that's the thing when you start to realize, okay, we've only got so much energy. Same with money too. We've only got so much money. What can we do within the framework of what we have? And that's where it gets really challenging, because like with houses, they'll lend you, there's a number. They've got it, the government, ever since the crisis of the late 2000s, they know the number they can give you, but it's a little bit, it pushes it a little bit for a lot of people's income. So they say, hey, you're qualified for a $350,000 house. And you're like, oh, well, let's go get a $350,000 house. But the question is that going to strap you every time? And what would it be like if you had a little margin in your finances to where you weren't pushing it to the limit every time? And so you had room for other stuff financially. And I think that's a challenge a lot of people get in. People tell me that all the time. They're like, man, I wish I could travel. And I think this gets into a whole nother talk on values.
Right.
But they've got, a car payment that's 3 of their car payments is what I spend for a trip to Europe for a couple of weeks. And I don't have a car that's as nice as theirs, but I know the limits on I know my limits financially. And so I figure out what can I do within those limits. But the challenge is, sometimes we forget we have limits, and then we try and ignore the limits that are there, but they're actually, if you would learn to work within them, there's actually a ton of freedom in there. But the challenge is, I hear that somebody told me the other day, I don't know how anybody can make a living anymore off $150,000 a year. And I was like, I'll show you how to make 3 lives out of $350,000 a year. But once you get used to a certain amount of excess, and then
we all live in a certain kind of a bubble.
Yeah.
Those around us, we associate with those in that bubble, and we feel like that's it, we're seeing a lot of the benefit of creativity in this thing. I really think, the coronavirus and all that, it's bad. Okay, let's check that off. It's bad, all right? But I really think we're seeing a lot of great things come out of this, and particularly for the church. For example, a lot of churches that have never done anything online all of a sudden are doing something online.
They're forced to, yeah.
Our church, for example, a couple weeks ago, they announced, okay, we're going to be doing a live streaming service. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, unless live streaming has changed a lot, we don't have the stuff to do that. And then they came back, well, we found out we don't have the equipment to do that, but we'll do it next week, And so sure enough, they did it, but they would have never done that. And I heard the pastor say, he said, we had more people online than we've ever had in church.
Yeah.
And you realize the outreach of that they probably, we'll do it one of these days. And when they're forced to, then all of a sudden, the creativity came in. Well, how are we going to reach people? We've got to do something different.
That's that Elliott quote. When you're forced to work within a strict framework, you're taxed your utmost. But if you have total liberty, you're likely to sprawl or just not get involved in certain things. Yeah.
And I called a pastor friend of mine, and I said, so how's it going? And he's actually retired, but he's still staying in touch with this little church. And I said, so they didn't do the live stream. He says, no, that guy's kind of technically challenged. But they did a Facebook Live thing, and it worked.
Yeah.
So they had to find some way to connect, even though they didn't have the resources to buy the equipment for online streaming or anything,
Yeah,
Facebook
and that is
Live.
part of the wonderful time of human history we live in, that if you've got a smartphone, you can broadcast to the world.
Crazy, huh?
It's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I see a lot of these churches. I've spoken at some of these churches that maybe have 150, 200 people, and they had 1,000 people watch their thing. Now, how long do they watch it? I don't know, but 1,000 people poking their head in your church service?
They checked in. Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's more than opened the back door and stuck their head in physically,
So it is creating a lot of creativity, and I think, again, the smaller businesses you're seeing, or the startups, they're getting a little more agile on it. And this is the heyday I always kind of wondered if those delivery services were going to make it, but then, man, this is their moment now. Yeah. And you get people conditioned to a new way of doing things. Like, oh, wow, this is great, man. I just clicked on the app, and 30 minutes later, food showed up on my door.
That's my concern with church. People go, man, this is great. I'm never going to a church again.
We got to show up.
I can watch 5 different services and pick which preacher I like the best and which worship I like the best. Yeah. And it's just like smorgasbord here. This is awesome.
So to kind of wrap it up, I think I guess I was going to ask what your advice would be, and then I was going to give my advice. Your advice would be to people who are looking at their life right now and saying, I've got a big dream in my heart, but I'm looking right now at our finances. I'm looking at the time, everything, and the energy I've got. Maybe I'm a little older than when I first had the dream. What's the advice you would give to people when they feel limited, but they've still got a desire to do something of value within them?
Well, this sounds really simple, but you have to start where you are. Mm-hmm. The old journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step type of a thing, And so if you're, whatever your dream is, maybe you can find somebody who's doing that and you can go help out and you can go volunteer and you can learn some things. Or maybe your dream is to reach 1,000, but you could start by reaching 1 and doing something for one person. This old starfish story. You throw the starfish in, you're not helping, but I helped that one starfish. Maybe you can help one person, and I think it's good starting small like that, because then you learn some lessons that I never anticipated that would be a problem.
Yeah,
and so then you're learning that lesson with 1 rather than with 100.
Yeah,
and it only costs you $1 instead of $100 to learn that lesson. So start where you are. Start small and do what you can do there, and then you're going to learn from that, and God's going to bless that, because, Jesus said this, if you're not faithful with a small thing, who's going to trust you with big things?
Yeah.
So be faithful with what you have right where you are, and then see what God does from there.
That reminds me of something Andy Stanley said. He said, do for the one what you wish you could do for all. And that's where it starts. And if we all start doing for one, things could improve quickly.
I would also suggest get your book, The Vision Map, because it really is very helpful to see how you can take one step and figure out what your step is, and then what you need to be praying for God to do in it as well.
Yeah. I was going to follow up on something you said too about the idea that the nice thing about starting small and when you're limited is that mistakes are a lot less costly.
Right.
If you've been wise, right? So you make, for example, a small business that decided they just had to have a building and they got the rent right now, and then all of a sudden revenues drop off during this time, and a lot of them are just going to be crushed because they have rent hanging over their head.
Right.
Whereas somebody who's been like, yeah, we're going to keep meeting from a Starbucks, Starbucks is now closed, but you don't have the rent hanging over your head of, a $3,000 a month rent back when, the economy was doing great. So I think that's a really important part, is that limitations can be a blessing because it actually makes the downside a little less down.
And I think in most times too, if you wait for God to provide rather than going to the bank, there are times when that might be the way to do it. But I believe God's lack of provision is just as directional as his provision.
Wow.
In other words, if it's not coming through, maybe he's saying, hey, don't go there.
Man, that's true. Because there's two specific things Emily and I've been praying for, and I've just been thinking any day he's going to open up the door. And 3 years I've been praying that, and he hadn't opened up the door, and that's really helpful that his lack of provision is actually speaking too.
Right.
Because I'm looking for kind of a fleece thing. I'm like, well, we need this, but it needs to be under these parameters. And of course I'm open, right? But that's the thing. It's easy. It would be easy to just jump out there. And when somebody's offering you what seems to get to take the lid off of your limitations, here's this money that there's strings to the money, but man, it'll take the lid off your limitations. But
we need to talk about the Ishmael principle and compromise as well one of these times.
So, okay, that actually might be a good one for our next podcast.
Maybe so. Stick around and let's see.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I guess the bottom line we would just want to encourage you with is if you feel limited right now, and it doesn't just have to be because of you're trapped at home, quarantine, but man, I think all of us at some point we feel limited. We've got a thing in our heart we want to do, but we just maybe we feel like we don't have the education, we don't have the training. By all means, go get educated, go get trained.
Right.
But understand this, that oftentimes your limitations can be your greatest asset to creativity, and it's a chance for God to come in and really come in.
Yeah, and two, if it's God's dream, he's the one who's going to make it happen. He's more interested in it happening than you are if it's his dream. And if it's not his dream, you probably don't want to get involved in it.
If you liked what you heard, please consider sharing this with a friend. For more information, visit joelmalm.com or rickmalm.com. Thanks for listening.